United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. Its menacing activities directly endanger the United States, our troops, our bases overseas, and our allies throughout the world. For 47 years, the Iranian regime has chanted death to America and waged an unending campaign of bloodshed and mass murder, targeting the United States, our troops, and the innocent people in many, many countries.
Now let's cross over to our Washington correspondent, Misha Komadovsky, standing by in Washington. Misha, first of all, what are you hearing there from your sources about this attack? What's the latest?
Well, the U.S. military is planning several days of attacks on Iran. That's what our sources confirmed to DW, and this plan includes a series of escalating strikes with pauses to basically assess the damage. President Donald Trump, as we just saw, posted a video in the middle of the night shortly after the operation began, saying that the U.S. forces were carrying out a massive and ongoing operation targeting Iran's military. The U.S. Department of Defense says that this joint U.S.-Israeli campaign is called Operation Epic Fury. It follows last year's strikes on Iran nuclear facilities, codenamed as Operation Midnight Hammer, and the strikes come just one day after indirect nuclear talks between Washington and Tehran. Iran's foreign minister said a deal was within reach, it was nearing, but President Trump said recently that he was not happy with the results and with the progress related to these talks. They don't want to say the key words. He said, we're not going to have a nuclear weapon, something that he mentioned even during his State of the Union address in the foreign policy section. And I got to say that the president had been weighing this possible military strike for a few weeks. He said on February 19th that he would take from 10 to 15 days to decide on this strike, but it's a contrast that we see here for a president who came back into office, criticizing decades of U.S. Foreign entanglement, something that he called this very way.
Yes, that leads straight into my next question. How is this being received by his base and among Americans in general?
Well, we've heard from Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a close ally of President Trump. He basically spent weeks and weeks pushing for this very intervention in Iran, and he called this operation necessary and long justified. He literally said, and I quote, "The end of the largest state sponsor of terrorism is upon us." That's what Graham wrote on the social platform X. But on the contrary, Senator Jack Reed, the top Democrat on the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, criticized the Trump administration for not briefing Congress ahead of these strikes. In a statement, he said that lawmakers received no clear explanation before this operation, and the White House was called out for this, not only by the Democrats but by the Republicans. Thomas Massey basically posted the same statement on social media, accusing the administration of not briefing the legislators before starting these attacks. So more and more reactions are coming from Capitol Hill, mind you. It's early morning here in D.C., so we're gonna see more reactions pretty much soon.
Now, we're also hearing about Iranian strikes on the U.S. allies Bahrain, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. How concerned is the Pentagon about a wider regional conflict?
We don't know, but we know for sure that the Pentagon was in touch with the Israeli counterparts for months, coordinating these efforts and preparing this operation. And from what I see, Gerhard, on social media here, some people in the United States, they say that the U.S. strikes on Iran resemble the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, but with several major differences. For instance, unlike George Bush, President Donald Trump said he would not. He was not basically seeking any backing from the United Nations Security Council or a vote in Congress before the strikes. As we are hearing from the legislators, they were not even briefed properly. That's what they are accusing the administration of. And the coalition is far smaller here than in 2003. Essentially, the U.S. and Israel, unlike the coalition of the willing back in the day. And the strategy appears to rely mostly on air power, which he argues, which some experts argue rarely leads to regime change.
Thank you very much. Misha Komadovsky there, reporting from Washington, D.C. And we can now go to Hans-Jakob Schindler. He is an expert on Iran at the Counter-Extremism Project and joins us from New York now. Hans-Jakob, US President Donald Trump is calling for the overthrow of the Iranian regime. Do you think this attack is going to lead to the downfall of the mullahs?
Well, it's certainly something that has never been attempted in this manner. Usually when we saw regime changes, it was done with ground troops to make sure that there is a physical removal of the regime. In addition, this regime is very different from a classic dictatorship. It's not Mubarak's Egypt or Assad's Syria, where one person leaves the country and everything changes. It is a multi-polar system with several power centers on which, of course, the supreme leader sits on top and moderates those power centers. But even if Ali Khamenei would die or leave the country, the regime could still function. So airstrikes will have to be very sustained and include not only physical infrastructure, but also regime leadership, with the hope that over time, people simply say, this is no longer working for me, and join the opposition, which remains unarmed. So step two after regime degradation, i.e. the takeover of the opposition, still is burdened by the fact that all elements of power, arms, intelligence, judiciary, police, army, Pasdaran are still on the side of the regime right now. And there's so far, and this is very, very early days, no real fissures visible within that power structure of the regime.
Now, last summer, Trump said Iran's nuclear program had effectively been destroyed in several attacks back then. Now he says one of the goals is to destroy Iran's military capabilities. So Iran was, in the end, continuing to enrich uranium, was it?
No one claims that Iran continued to enrich uranium. It was clear that, of course, not all elements of the program were physically destroyed and that some part of the 60% enriched uranium was maintained by the regime. But what's clear is that the regime began in the last couple of weeks, again, efforts to rebuild aspects of that program. They made a massive push to rebuild its ballistic missile program because they understood from everything that they fired at Israel, the ballistic missiles, the most modern parts that they had, were the ones who actually had a chance to getting through. And we're seeing now repeat of the strategy that they had at the end of the 12-day war, not hundreds of rockets and drones in one go, but smaller waves, but several times a day to inflict economic damage on Israel because Israelis will hardly be able to leave their shelters. That's what the regime strategy is. And it was clear they are going to reconstruct their nuclear enrichment program because what you can bomb is the centrifuges and the stockpiles, but you cannot erase the knowledge of the technicians and of the scientists who have built this program. And the Iranian technicians know how to build centrifuges. You destroy them, they are going to rebuild them again.
Now, let's talk a bit more about this possible regime change. Who is there to replace the current government in Tehran?
That is the problem with step two. It is unclear. So Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of the late Shah of Iran, is an identification figure, much bigger than I thought, and much bigger than I thought was the case in 2022, of the opposition at large. But the opposition at large is not a well-functioning, well-organized group within the country, and it remains unarmed. And if anything else, the regime has very clearly demonstrated in January how much violence and ruthless violence it is willing to exert on its own population. Tens of thousands are still in prison. At the moment, there are show trials going on. Every evening, there was a confession on television inside Iran. So the regime tries to instill fear. Now, if the opposition remains unarmed, I'm not clear how this is supposed to work. Unfortunately, the part of the regime, of all the various power centers, that has the highest survival rate or opportunity within a situation like this, airstrikes, is the Revolutionary Guard, which has military power, intelligence power, and economic influence, and is internationally connected. So what is possible is that while the regime cannot survive without the guards can certainly function without the regime, and then we transition from a religiously infused oligarchy that we have in Iran right now into a classic military dictatorship. Doesn't really make things better for the people of Iran, doesn't really make anything better for the relationship of Iran to the proxies, which is managed exclusively by the Revolutionary Guard. So whether this is going one way or the other is still very much unpredictable at this point.
Now, there were talks going on about Iran's nuclear program between the US and Iran until last week, and now this sudden attack. What do you make of the timing here?
Look, I mean, in this one, actually, Trump has been quite consistent. The American side had made very clear there are three issues where they need the regime to compromise. The nuclear program, in particular enrichment, no enrichment on the ground. Some limitations to their ballistic missile program, and the end of their relationship to their proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias in Iraq. The regime was trying to do what it always does. It is the master of negotiations for negotiation's sake, is to draw out these talks and push the American side to a compromise on part of this, i.e. just Iranian enrichment, and trying to give as a take back economic benefits for the American side. They offered access to the oil industry, to the communications industry, to the gas industry, and thought they could get a partial deal with the Trump administration. Now, I was very clear when that offer was given in Geneva, and it included just a temporary suspension of the nuclear program, that was far from sufficient for the American side, given the position that they had taken and the military assets they've built up in the region. So it was pretty clear after what happened in Geneva that this was coming. Maybe days, but it was clear that it's coming.
Thank you very much, Hans-Jakob Schindler, there for this very clear and candid analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And joining me now in the studio is our Middle East analyst, Shani Rozanes. Shani, earlier you have said it was inevitable that Tehran would strike back. Now it has, apparently across the region. What's next?
Well, that's a great question. I think, there's no doubt that the Iranians are not done yet. They have said all through the negotiations in the last weeks that it doesn't matter the scale of attack they're going to be facing. There's going to be a fierce response, and we're seeing that it was it was an attack on a big scale. And so I think it's hard to say that the Iranians are done yet. I think a lot of it depends on what we're seeing when hearing from Israeli sources is they are hinting at a very successful hit at top commanders and top politicians in the Iranian regime. If this is the case, then it's hard to see. There's two scenarios. There's either the need for revenge and escalation, but there also could be complete, chaos that and a breakdown that might prevent the Iranians to actually fully be able to respond as they maybe would have wanted or wished or have planned on in their planning scenarios. So we are still at the thick of it. These are just the first few hours. Again, Israeli sources, American sources also are talking about a couple of days. If we take the precedent of June 2025, this is when Israel initiated the last attack on Iran just 8 months ago. That took 12 days, and the goal in Israel and the U.S. is for this operation to be shorter.
Let's hear from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He has spoken recently. Let's listen into what he had to say.
In the last months, the Iranian tyrants have been plotting to rebuild their nuclear and ballistic capabilities and to hide them underground where we cannot hit them. If we will not stop them now, they will be immune to attacks. This is why the Iranian representatives to the negotiations are trying to buy time in futile and deceitful talks with our American friends. But the Iranian tyrants have made a dire mistake, since the Americans are not falling for their lies, and we will not sit idly by as a threat of destruction is looming above us.
What do you make of this?
Well, very much like Trump, the two leaders are trying to build the case and bringing, this is just one part of a longer speech that he had given, going back, detailing all the, the accusation sheet against Iran for the 47 years of this regime and everything that he has done as a major planner, executor, and funder of terror worldwide. We need to keep that in mind. And this is what the case that Netanyahu is building inside and helping Trump build outside. So this is one thing to keep in mind. But we also need to think, we were just 8 months ago in a place where both the Americans and the Israelis, eventually the Americans, it started with the Americans, have given such a serious blow to the Iranian ballistic and nuclear missiles that they have, Trump words were, they have claimed to have obliterated that threat. 8 months in, we are back in the same place. And Netanyahu was talking about how the Iranians are trying to deceive the West with false intentions in the negotiations. That might be the case. But still, when we're talking about the long term, what is the strategic goal? How do we break this conundrum of the need for, are we starting a new reality of annual attacks and exchanges where both sides need to empty their artillery and weaponry on each other? Or can there be another solution? We're still, as I said, at the first phases of the military operation ongoing. But on the long term, there's got to be a way to try and break this and think of what can be the solution. And when you look at Netanyahu, when you look at the Israel government, for them it's clear. The only way to break the pattern is the removal of the regime. And if you try to understand the division of labor among Israelis and Americans in this operation, the Israelis have focused more on the targeted assassinations of leaders in Iran, and the Americans are focusing more on the nuclear and the missile facilities, so more of the defense military capabilities.
But in the end, this will be about regime change. And can that be achieved from the air alone and with these targeted attacks that you have described? Well,
I think the Americans, what we've also, heard Trump articulating in his speech, they hope that this is a domino effect. They hope that the instability in the country, the economic dire conditions, that will be, this will be a big enough of a momentum to carry the Iranian people to finish the job. Because there is no military way to remove the regime. I mean, there is a way to remove some of his leaders, apparently, that's what the Israelis are hinting at. We don't have any confirmation for that. But the mechanism that the regime has built throughout the years with the Revolutionary Guards, you also have the level of the military. We know this is a very, very elaborate, well-functioning operation of leadership and command and very elaborate systems. So, and we're talking also about masses and numbers, unlike, for example, in Venezuela and Maduro. We're talking about at least the minimum assumption is 2 to 4 million people who are connected to the Revolutionary Guards, to the besieged, to the secret, military police in Iran, forces supporting the regime and supporting, the stability and the further the oppression
and leading the regime as well.
Correct. So even if we also know, we've heard reports this week before this attack, as everybody was gearing up towards this, that the Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei and all of the leadership have already made a very clear chart of succession, up to 4 places. What happens if they are killed, and then the person after them, and the person after them is killed. So they are ready for that. And for them, the most important goal is to maintain and sustain the regime and everything that stands behind it, the religious principle behind it, the ideas behind it, the revolution that they were trying to start already back then in '79. And so they want to hope that the establishment that they have built is going to outlive them, even if they are removed.
Now, in many ways, the strike on Iran we were building up to it over a couple of weeks at least. It doesn't come as a surprise, but the timing.
Yeah.
Why now?
Well, Trump said he really wanted to hear from his closest envoys Kushner and Witkoff, who were just there in Geneva on Thursday, and he wanted to get their assessment on how serious the Iranians are. He had given them a deadline last week, and they had hinted that they're willing to make great concessions. It seems that the concessions they're willing to make are not big enough, because the Americans have asked them to agree to zero enrichment. This was a red line that the Iranians have always said they're not going to give. What they were willing to give is a freeze of the enrichment. The Iranians, for them, found it to be a very big concession, because part of the principle that the Iranians are setting here is that they see it as their right as a sovereign country. And more than that, the more aggression and the more attacks they're getting, for them, it's just reassuring them the need for nuclear as their insurance policy, as the only mean to sustain and support their defense and their sovereignty. So we are now at a time this morning, it was on at the dawn of the day. I think the Israelis and Americans were hoping to catch the Iranians somewhat off guard. The element of surprise is minimal, but I think they have, after this build-up in last weeks, but in a way, I think, again, looking at the timing, there was supposed to be another session of talks on Monday. It just like what happened in June. Both times the attack came as talks were set to resume with a very clear date, and in both times we see that the Americans are not patient enough to wait. And part of it, is it a decoy? Is it a strategy? It's all together.
Now, I would like to come back to Israel. Now, let's talk about the sentiment in Israel. How do average Israelis think about this? Do you think they're behind these attacks?
Well, they're very torn. There was a survey just last week talking about 50% of Israelis supporting this attack, Israel initiating this attack. I think knowing that the Americans are there together, it might be giving a bit more support to Israelis to support it, knowing that Israel has not done it alone, that there was this technical backing and military backing, but also the idea that Netanyahu has become, along the years, such a polarizing figure. There's always, among those who are against him, the fear that he is maybe motivated by politics. I think when the Americans are joining there's an understanding that maybe there's something bigger there. So, and also we got to remember, there's still people who are not back in their houses after the attack just 8 months ago in June. The damage inflicted on Israel was quite big. And another point is that the Israeli arsenal of defense missiles is quite depleted. They have not managed to catch up with production in a level that is satisfactory in case this attack escalates to an all-out attrition war that's going to last for many days with a trickle of Iranian attacks at Israel. That might be very hard for the Israeli defense system to sustain for a long time.
Shani Rozanes there, I'm Middle East analyst. Shani, thank you very much. For now, we're going to come back to you.